The first rule of responsive web design is you do not talk about responsive web design.
Second rule, you want to make sure your website looks good and slick on all different screen sizes.
We don't want to see scaled down desktop views or watered down interfaces just because those people are browsing on the go.
Third rule, using things like grid and flexbox to structure your content initially will help you adjust for different breakpoints down the line.
Want to know the rest? I'll show you how I made this Fight Club website fully scalable and responsive on all different screen sizes. I may not be the most responsive right now, but that doesn't mean that your website doesn't have to be.
So here I have a landing page that acts like a recruitment site for Fight Club.
Now, are the first two rules of Fight Club to not talk about Fight Club? Does it make sense that they would have a recruitment website if this was the case? Not at all. But these are my rules here, so.
We'll go section by section and adjust the styling so everything looks just as good on different breakpoints as we get smaller on different devices. Because right now, you'll see that as we scale down, things get very clumped together and they do not look good at all. And we'll take care of all that. So starting with our navbar, we have the navbar element in use here with a link block for the logo here and a little nav menu for these two nav links. And there's a div behind it with that pink splatter, so when you hover, it just has that cool effect right there. So the first thing to note is that by default, Webflow lets you style on the desktop base breakpoint. So that's what we use when we build out everything we want. But if we want to change it, we would click the different versions here. So we have a tablet and mobile landscape, which is like a turned phone. And then this is the regular mobile view, portrait on a phone. It's important to make sure that when you click through, it shows you what your design will look like on each of these different devices. So I always start from this one. Sometimes people do the mobile first approach where they do it all on mobile and then work their way up. But I like using the desktop because an important thing to know is that styles trickle down. So basically when I built it all in this desktop view, all these different sizes absorbed the same styling. Now I'll go into this more in detail later, but basically whatever I change here is going to affect each of the three because all the styling is moving downward. Another thing to note off the bat is that there are different sizes within one breakpoint. So this is the desktop breakpoint that we're on now, and we can grab the edges of our designer until it has that little arrow icon right there, and then we can drag this in, and technically we are still on our desktop view. This is because there are different widths within the same viewport, right? So you've seen different computer sizes, laptops don't all have the same screen size, but they're all technically the desktop view, which is kind of the wider one. But there are different size MacBooks and all that, desktop iMacs. Though I designed it looking like this, I have to make sure that even on this breakpoint, it would look okay when I squished it together down like this. So it's important to grab your slider here and adjust and see how everything is looking as you build. And on the bottom, you'll see these little black dots when I hold this down. Those are the different kind of Apple devices. So there's a MacBook Pro right there. The bigger I get, that's the iMac 21.5 inch. So it does show you which device you're kind of looking at within that one desktop breakpoint. So back to our navbar. On desktop view, it's pretty good. It's already, that's how we put it. We have a container and this is all here. Even on the smaller viewport of this, it works. But the second we click tablet, you'll see that it becomes a hamburger menu. So this is by default in Webflow. I'm using the navbar element in the panel over here. And when you drag that in, it automatically creates the hamburger menu on tablets and smaller. This is great, it's very user-friendly, but it does change our styling a little bit. So as you see here, this little icon, we can affect some spacing on this viewport. I'm gonna add a little bit margin on the top here, just the center in the middle. Maybe somewhere around 15 looks okay. And then when you have your menu button selected, you can go to the settings, and when you click Open Menu, that's when your drop-down menu will appear. Now you'll see this doesn't look great. It absorbs some of the styling we had, but it doesn't work the same. So I'm going to click on a nav link. I'll just go up the chain one to the nav menu, which is the whole box. I had some padding from earlier, but on this breakpoint we don't need it because it creates that separation, right? So I'll just make sure that's at 0. I can change the background color of the menu. I'll make it the black color. That's the same as the nav menu. And then it still has that splatter, right? It still looks kind of cool here, but maybe let's affect the nav link and we can center the text. So we go to text align, just put that in the middle. That way the splatter still remains behind the text itself. And lastly, this menu button, See how it has that gray background as well? We can make it that black, but maybe we'll do it a little bit lighter so people know that it's open. There we go, and we can go back to our settings to close that. And then when we click preview, we'll see on this breakpoint, when we click it, there we go. This looks a lot more neat. And because it's in this container too, we can also add a little bit of more padding on either side. Holding down Alt, I can just select both edges here, and maybe I'll push that into about 20, just to give it some breathing room on either side. So remember what I said before about how styles trickle down. So when we're in our desktop view, everything we made went downwards into the tablet view, the portrait, and all these. But now we're in tablet. So just an example, if I am on our navbar container, let's say I give it a different background color of like red. And then when I go down, you'll see all of these are red now. But if I go back to the original desktop, it still remains that black color because it's not going to trickle upwards. So whatever you set on that breakpoint, that'll stay, and it will move downwards. But if you override it manually, now it's red. But I can even go here and I can change this one to maybe a blue, purplish. But then I go up, it's still red. This one's still black. But then what color should the mobile one be? If everything's trickling down, it'll look to the next one above it. So this is purple, so the mobile should be purple. And it's purple. There we go. And if you ever need to know if you've changed something already, if you see the orange highlight on the styling text that you're looking at, you can just click to see where it's coming from, and that's coming from the navbar container. From the mobile landscape, you'll see it directs you to where all this is coming from. And if you ever want to reset it, all you have to do is click reset, and that'll go back to normal of what is above it. But obviously we don't want this, so I'm going to reset the red as well. So now they all will stay black. Okay, so now let's look at our hero section. It's got 2 images of Brad Pitt and Edward Norton.
And reflected behind them are each other. Foreshadowing.
So this is how it looks here. It looks pretty good, even when we scale it to the middle. It's getting close, but it still works. When we go to tablet though, see how things start to get a little cluttered. It kind of works still, but maybe we can affect some of the sizing of these elements just to give it some more breathing room and so things don't look as cluttered. So let's affect our Brad Pitt image. I can change the height of this maybe to 500 instead. I can change Edward to 500. The whole section as a whole, right now it's 60 VH. On tablet, maybe we'll just make it 50 VH, shrink things down. And the divs behind it, it's called Pink Hero Accent. Maybe I'll make this 400 width instead. Same with this one. Maybe I'll make this one 300 width. And then the main thing is just the legibility of the text, right? We want to make sure people can still read it. So yeah, this one looks pretty good now. And back on our mobile, let's look at our rules section. So here's the rules section. Everything just lives in a section and then usually a container just to add some spacing in the middle, make sure everything aligns neatly. But for our rules, you'll see we have a grid in place. So grids are great for manipulating content on different breakpoints. If you design your layout using grid initially, you'll save a lot of time for yourself down the line. So you'll see I have a 2x4 grid, 4 columns, 2 rows. Each cell has a div, and inside that div is just the rule text and content. And all of these have the same classes, so when I style one of them, everything will change at the same time. This is the view on desktop. When we go to this tablet view, things start looking a little cramped, right? So maybe it's not best to have 4 columns here. We can maybe delete one of these. That would give some more space to each of the text. So best thing about grid is you can just target the grid itself. So if I just go over to the right where all the column settings are, I can just delete one, and automatically you'll see all the content adjust to fill the space. I'll add a 3rd row as well. So now we've got a 3x3 grid, and the content looks a lot better already. Now I can even maybe shrink this text a little bit. It's starting to get a little cramped again. There we go. That looks pretty good. And just make sure when you use your little scaler, everything looks good still. For little chunks of text and things, you can definitely just use pixels. I find it's pretty easy just to use on different breakpoints, and you can change it to whatever you'd like. For something like this image, right, you'll see I have 44 VW, so it's 44% of the viewport width. So the Fight Club will scale. You see how it's a lot bigger here on bigger screen sizes because it's taking up 44% of a larger screen. So you definitely want that to be the focus, and sometimes viewport is definitely a good option. Just be mindful when you're using VW. Sometimes a lot of people use the plus on their keyboard, right? So I'm pressing that right now, and it zooms everything in, but it doesn't scale. So you'll see how a lot of my content's zooming in. It doesn't look good. So I'll just go back to 100. So just be mindful of VW. Usually pretty good, but sometimes it could not be. Also, if your text looks off, you might have it on the left. It might look okay on certain sizes, but maybe when you're expanding and going down to tablet, you'll notice, oh, I never centered that. So you can always just check your text align and move that to the center if needed. So next is our Join Us Contact section. And this is just a big section. It's got two divs taking up 50% of their parent's width. So the first div has the image of Brad Pitt and this Join Us text.
I put a blur filter on it to almost give it that I've been punched in the eye so many times that this is how I see now look.
And this other div just has our contact div here with this little form block in it. So the section itself is displayed flex. So like Grid, Flexbox is a really powerful tool that really will let you reformat your content on different devices with the click of a button. So clicking on the join section, you'll see here it's displayed flex horizontally, which means that both the divs, which is the one Brad Pitt div and one the contact form div, they're just spaced horizontally next to each other. And that works on this breakpoint. Obviously, it looks pretty good. But when we go down to tablet, you'll see he starts getting cut off. Things don't look as good. So maybe instead of horizontal, it'd be better to stack these divs vertically. So right away, you'll see it readjusts things. But now I can even make more adjustments. So if I do the Join Us div, which is the Brad Pitt one, so right now it's at 50% width, but I can make it 100% width instead. Now it takes up the full width, and I'll do the same for the contact one. There we go. But I want to center align this, so I'll just justify center for this. And this Join Us div, I can shrink this down because right now it is not looking great. So it had a big margin before to center it where I wanted it to. Put that at 0. I can change the font size. It was at 200 pixels, which is pretty large. I could even affect the rotation because I do have a rotate property on it. So instead of 20, I'll make this a little more horizontal so we can read it. There we go. And I'll add some margin beneath this div. Give some spacing. Same with this. I can actually just affect the whole section itself. Put some margin beneath. Maybe 50. Now you see on tablet we're creating a little bit too much black space. So I'm going to get rid of that top margin that I had from earlier. And that just kind of condenses things a little bit better. And now this looks pretty good. Now it's better stacked on top. So flex, really important. You can change it from horizontal to vertical and stack things the way you want it, make it fit better. And this section here, I just did a little kind of design of Marla because she's so badass, she's so cool. Love Helena Bonham Carter. So I just have some alternating divs. These two are rotated upside down. There's just a little filler space before you get to the footer content here. So she looks pretty good there, and she looks all right, but she's still getting a little squished. So maybe I'll reduce the height of the section itself because that won't stretch it out as much. So right now it's at 600. If I made it half, made it 300, that already looks better. Then she's still kind of in the right aspect ratio, looks pretty good. So next we have our footer, and I have another grid in place here. 2 columns with a div inside. So you'll see here, it's just 2 column grid with a div for the Fight Club logo, and then this div has 3 smaller divs, each taking up about 30% of its container. That way they're all evenly spaced. So they look good here on our desktop, even when we scale. But when we go to our tablet, they start looking a little squished and ugly. So to change this grid, let's do kind of a similar thing, but almost the opposite. So let's click to affect our grid here. And I'm going to add another row right beneath it here. And I'm going to make sure I'm in my div. So this is the footer logo div. Right here I have position set to auto. That's kind of by default. And what this means is it fills the first available space in a grid. So when you're first building something out, this is pretty nice because everything will just flow and fill the available space that's there. But now when you want to start manipulating it the way you want it, if you just click manual, then you have more power to change them. So I'm just going to put them both to manual, the container divs. And now you can drag it wherever you want in an empty space. So because we created that second row at the bottom, now we have that space to fill and I can put something there. And then when you click on these red lines, you can just expand things however you want them. So I'm going to make that one take up the whole first row itself. And then this one's going to take up the bottom row. Now I can align this a little differently. I'm going to want to flex, justify this in the center. And then I can go to the footer info divs themselves, which have the header and the little sub content, and I can center align those. And again, see how it's really wide up here? This is from before, but now we don't need as much padding. So I'm just gonna shrink all this down. 10 is even pretty good. Do the same for this, make it 10. But it's a little close to the bottom, so maybe I'll just give it some bottom margin of about 40. And then you'll see here, so this is another tricky thing with text. it looks okay here, right? But then when you shrink it down a little bit more, you'll notice, oh, it's still text aligned to the left. So when we make our footer info content class, we'll just make it text align center. So there we go. We got through the first tablet view here. And this is our desktop, and it looks okay. And now tablet, we made it look just as nice. Next thing we can do is head down to our mobile landscape. So again, everything trickles down, right? So we just did everything on the tablet, which means the mobile landscape and the mobile portrait already absorbed everything we just did. So a lot of the times it'll look okay, but you're still gonna have to make some minor adjustments as you go, but it gets less and less work each time because you're already making it adjustable for the different breakpoints. So now that we're on mobile landscape, our hero section, it's looking a little tall again, so I think we can change our viewport height. We can lower this again, maybe make it 40 now. Let's shrink Brad and Edward again. Maybe make this 400, and make him 400. Well, not 4,000, oh no, giant Ed. Maybe he's the Hulk, Edward Horton, haha. And then let's shrink these guys again. Let's make this maybe 300. Oh, it doesn't look bad. I've got some weird radiuses on the images, which are kind of giving those warpy shapes. Kind of looks like the soap, which is why I kept it, kind of on theme. Maybe I'll make Brad a little less wide so he doesn't cover the text as much. But this gets a little tricky just because when I go to the most narrow version of a mobile landscape, things are pretty condensed. I mean, you can play around with it. You might not need all these elements. Maybe I just hide these on this breakpoint, these pink accent divs. And then I can always kind of get rid of this margin for the two characters. Make them live against the edges there. I can shrink this font size, and I can lower its max width, so that way it condenses. So now when I shrink in, it's not perfect, but that's the way you can play around with things. And you can hide and show different elements if you don't need them on smaller breakpoint sizes. Going down to our grid, I think we can get rid of another column, right? So remember, we just go to the settings of the column. Let's remove it again. 2 is good in this breakpoint. I think we still have enough room to make that work. Let's see the text size. Maybe lower it a little bit, but that still is readable on each of the breakpoints. Good, good. And here, our contact form. Flexbox usually always works and kind of sustains itself. So we've got our Flexbox, and it still kind of looks good on this mobile landscape. Padding's good. Everything is readable still. I'll leave that. Marla, I like her down here. That looks all right still. I think in the footer we can change the sizing of these texts, though. Maybe make that 16. Okay, good. And let's go down to our last one, which is our mobile. Ooh, looks like they're kissing now. This design is a little tricky with this. I can maybe shrink the size of this logo as well. So right now it's 80 by 80. Maybe we've got 60 by 60. I can change all the spacing up here. So this was 15. Now let's make that 0. And let's open our menu. I think I can change the font size of this text now. So this is a very small size. It's rare that people have this kind of like iTouch or iPhone sort of very narrow device. So I don't always go crazy about trying to make it fit on this, but it's still important to consider. But usually the wider one is a safe bet. But again, my Brad and Ed are kind of interrupting the design here. And that's on me. This is probably not the most friendly design, but I can just move them maybe a little bit off the screen, give it some negative margin. That way they're still visible, but you can still read the text there. Go, and maybe this needs some more margin now because it's going to be moving up on the smaller ones. And I can probably change this from 44. I can make this a little bit bigger. I'll make it 72 VW. Cool. And that text gets pretty narrow, but you can still read it. It's good. All right, and now let's go to our grid again. Let's get rid of another column. And now everything will live in their own column. Looks pretty good. Padding's okay. You can still read the sides. Good, good, good. Just makes it a little bit longer. Here's our join us section again. I can shrink this, lower this font size again. Let's make this a little smaller. So when we shrink our mobile device, it still says join us. And it's okay if it's a little off screen. It's kind of a cool design effect, right? The brain and the eyes will still complete the text. Like we can still all read that even though it's blurry. Not the most user-friendly for accessibility, but this is a very specific example. Brad still looks okay at this height. Our form is okay. Gets a little squished on these devices, but again, this is not something to worry about. And Marla here, let's see. What if I made her 200? Yeah, doesn't look that bad. I'm gonna shrink the size of the things here. It's good. So here's an example where we can use grid and Flexbox together, right? So this is all in a grid. We got the 2 cells. The first one takes up the whole row. The second one takes up the second row. But then this is a div in itself with 3 children, these 3 divs, right? So if I change this to vertical, there we go. Now those stack on top of each other, and they're definitely more readable as you scale down. This gets pretty tiny, so I can change the image to take up maybe 50% of its container instead of 30. So once you feel like you've adjusted everything you need to, you can go to the preview mode, and you'll see here we've got our site. Make sure everything looks okay. This is the first breakpoint here. You can grab the sides of it and just go all the way through each breakpoint. So you can go really slow. You're on desktop, everything looks good. And then at some point you'll see it switch over. So there it goes to the tablet view. And then we'll see our hamburger menu appear. We can test that out. Click that, it opens. Good. And you can keep going down. And then you'll see there's the point where our 2 background pictures disappear. And then it's the other design that we have. And we'll see the grid column also go from 3 to 2 once we go to mobile landscape. And then we have our mobile where they push backwards so they're not kissing. And then you can scale through all the way. So you can just go through and make sure everything looks the way you had it. You see how things go from flex horizontal to flex vertical. All of our rules adjust. And Marla shrinks a little bit as we go down. Great. And then footer, all that grid and flexing happens vertically instead. And you can add more breakpoints for larger devices. So if you click here, you can add a new breakpoint for a bigger device, 1280, 1440, 1920. But just something to remember is that instead of trickling down like we're doing with these would trickle up. So say I had a background color of blue for the entire website for 1280. It would trickle upwards, and each of the larger ones would also have a blue background at those big devices. So to change that, you just have to go to the individual thing and go to 1440, make it a red background, make this one a green background if you want. But these are optional. They're not always required, which is why they're hidden by default. I'm working on a 27-inch iMac, and I rarely build things for bigger sizes because this is the view that I'm in now. And as long as you have a container that kind of scales your content, doesn't make things too wide or too narrow, you should be okay without adding your own breakpoints and making things on a larger viewport.
So we did it. We made our website look fully responsive. It's really important to take the time to do this, ensure all your pages look good on the different breakpoints. It sends the message that you are professional and that you are inclusive to anyone trying to use your website on different devices while they shop and they buy things and use your services. And I know they're trying to buy things because we are all consumers. We're all byproducts of a lifestyle of obsession, and the things you own, though, will end up owning you. And this is your life, and even though it's wasting away 1 minute at a time, you still have time to build a killer responsive website before you go.